All right, well, hello, everyone. My name is Dave Cantor. I'm one of the co-editors of the Journal of Supply Chain Management. I'm pleased that you could join us today. We have, looks like several participants, several people interested in today's webinar. And I'll go ahead and begin sharing my screen so that I can share some opening thoughts with you. And then we'll have several of our eminent and emerging scholars talk about their research on today's topic. So let me go ahead and begin. So the agenda for today's call is to have a brief discussion on our 5th Emerging Discourse Incubator. We'll have 5-minute presentations by our invited author teams. And the goal of today's session is to facilitate a conversation about the research presentations that will be shared with you today. We'll certainly invite discussion on each of these topics throughout this morning's session. And then we'll conclude today's session with an open forum and just general discussion about the papers that were presented. So the title of the EDI is Leveraging Multiple Types of Resources Within the Supply Chain Network for Competitive Advantage. And we've traditionally thought about issues of competition from a competitive dynamics perspective, which several of us had learned when we were at the University of Maryland many years ago, in terms of the idea of competitive moves and counter moves amongst rival firms. And what we're interested in doing as a part of this EDI is to extend that concept to general notions of competition, as well as how the supply chain plays an important resource in enabling the firm to leverage resources in its supply chain network, to look at how firms are managing these resources in today's public policy environment, to look at the unique role of resources from an information technology perspective to enable supply chain processes across supply chain networks, and to also look at the role of employees in teams in terms of how those individuals and their personalities and attitudes and behaviors can allow organizations to leverage resources in their supply chain network for competitive advantage purposes. So we'll go into some of these concepts in a little bit more detail with each of our presenting authors so that you can learn how they are tackling these issues in their research more broadly in general, as well as specific to this EDI. And they'll provide you with some definitions and some explanation of these concepts as they present their research to you today. So the whole overall goal of EDIs in general is to stimulate further research on topics that haven't received a lot of attention yet. And we think that these research questions that will be presented today are important to investigate to further our understanding about theory in the supply chain. We extended an invitation to today's presenting authors earlier this year, and they've been working on their papers for many months. And we're anticipating accepting these papers and publishing them online by January of 2022. And what we would like for you to consider is conducting research in some of these areas and submitting your research to the Journal of Supply Chain Management for publication consideration. We certainly want to continue building on some of the thoughts and ideas that were expressed today, as well as those thoughts that are published in the invited articles and future research that appears in the journal. So what I'd like to do is turn the discussion over to our invited authors. And these are the titles of the papers that will be briefly discussed today. And again, we'd like to facilitate a conversation on each of these subjects in our call this morning with you. So what I'm going to do is turn the presentation over to Christian Hoffer from the University of Arkansas. And he's going to share with you some of the ideas that him and his team members have been working on as a part of their research paper.
Thank you very much, Dave. Good morning, everybody. To begin, I want to thank, of course, you, Dave, and the co-editors at JSCM, Ting Ting, Wendy, and Mark, for the opportunity. We really do appreciate it. So we're here to talk about broadening our understanding of interfirm rivalry, which is kind of a lofty goal, right? But the idea is to help generate research ideas and flesh out and stimulate research on how supply networks shape competitive behavior and ultimately, of course, firm profitability. I also want to acknowledge my co-authors here, of course. Jordan Barker is at the University of Texas, El Paso. He's going to hate me for this, but it's also his birthday today. So happy birthday, Jordan. I would sing if I could, but I can't. Laura Doria is Italian, which is my favorite thing. And she's also at Iowa State University. Hey, Laura. And then John Johnson is also a management scholar here at the Walton College at the University of Arkansas. So let me kind of try to walk you, and I know Dave gave us an ambitious 5-minute goal here, but let me try to walk you through the logic here a little bit. And I want you to focus on the center of the slide for now. And I want to explain a little bit what we mean by competition and competitive behavior. Usually when we think of competition, it's between firms that compete, for example, in the product market. So that's what we call product market rivalry. And of course, in a supply chain context, factor market rivalry is also a big topic. Many papers published, including by Lisa Elbrum, for example. I know Wendy Tate, Peter Ralston, Matt Schwieterman, and several others have looked at rivalry that happens not in the product market, but when it comes to sourcing capabilities or inputs from suppliers. So that's factor market rivalry. But then, of course, there's also another type of competition, really, when you think about value creation and appropriation. So sometimes competitors actually have exchange relationships. So you're looking at buyers and suppliers, for example, and they compete for appropriating some of that profit that is generated in those exchange relationships. So the point is, there's different types of rivalry. And when we talk about competitive behavior, we talk about firms' conduct in terms of those different kinds of rivalry. So the types and the sets and nature of their actions that they implement, of course, in pursuit of profitability. So when we talk about firm performance here, we're very much focused on financial performance. And there's a very nice paper out there by McAdock 2011 that really neatly outlines exactly how competitive activity, actions of firms, actually translate to greater financial performance. I'm not going to go through those in detail, of course, but just very briefly, competitive advantage. So the idea is asset or resource endowments convey an advantage over the competition that is not easy to replicate. Rivalry restraint as a profit-generating mechanism refers to the idea of limiting the degree of competition such that you're performing better. You can also create or exploit information asymmetries, and you can time your actions in such a way that it helps generate greater profitability. So everything I've just said is pretty much what you might call standard strategic management stuff. Now, the key part, of course, that we're focusing on here is what you see on the left-hand side of the slide. So this idea that supply network characteristics, and I use this term in a broader sense, actually shape the nature of competition, the nature of firms' competitive behavior, and ultimately firm performance. So when we talk about supply networks, we're really looking at different levels, if you will, of supply chain relevant characteristics. So they could be supply chain partner firm characteristics. Think of R&D capabilities, IT capabilities, for example. Then there are relational characteristics. Think of interdependence or the degree of collaboration. And then you have structural characteristics. Think of concentration or centrality, for example. And what we try to make explicit here is that these supply network characteristics, even though it may not always be explicit in the extant literature, really to a very significant degree shape firms' competitive behavior and are thus a source of a superior firm performance. So that's the basic premise of what we're trying to do. And Dave, if you advance to the next slide, I'll give a brief overview of what we're trying to accomplish specifically. Thank you, Dave. So the first thing we want to do, if you focus on the left-hand side here, is provide a structured overview of the literature. And again, the term competition is fairly broad. And accordingly, the literature is a bit spread out. Of course, there's a lot in strategic management, but there also is literature in supply chain and operations management, for example. And so we try to bring all this together and provide a very comprehensive and structured lay of the land. And in so doing, and that of course, again, is important to us, and that's item number 2 you see towards the top of the graph, we want to highlight or make explicit what may have been implicit at times, how certain supply chain characteristics actually fuel or drive the competitive behavior of firms, and then explain how and why exactly that results in greater financial performance. So that's where we're looking at item 3 on the lower right-hand side. And having established all that, our goal then is to outline, okay, now that we understand what has been done, what has not been done. So what are the opportunities that we see for supply chain related research in this competition domain? And in the interest of time, I'm going to leave you with just a few thoughts on that. So Dave, if you would go to the next slide, please. Here's just a bit of a laundry list, really, of some of the thoughts and ideas we've come up with. And again, I'm not going to go through all of those, and I presume the slides will be available to you later. And of course, I hope you'll all read the article that'll, as Dave said, will come out in January as well. And you'll see more detail on these ideas. I'm just going to pick out one that is highlighted in red here, and the others are equally interesting in my mind. When you look at the competition literature, there's usually a great focus on a focal firm. And what I mean by that is we tend to focus on whatever a firm does will affect its performance. Now, the question is, of course, and we know this as supply chain scholars, firms don't operate in a vacuum, right? They're part of these bigger supply networks. And so to what extent can a firm rely on supply chain partners upstream or downstream to help it compete more effectively? Can, let's say, a supplier's competitive activity effectively complement or maybe sometimes even substitute for a focal firm's competitive actions? So I think there's just tremendous opportunity in bringing more of a supply chain dimension to studies of competition and how competition relates to financial performance. Now, again, in the interest of time, I'll leave it at that, and I'm sure there'll be questions and thoughts and ideas. And I do want to, before we leave, of course, preemptively thank the reviewers also for the thoughts that I'm sure they'll share. So we'll continue to work on this, and any ideas and thoughts you have today will help us make this a better paper. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Christian. So in the spirit of having a conversation about these research papers and their reported ideas, does anyone want to begin by asking any follow-up questions to Christian and the team? Kate raised her hand, so go ahead, Kate.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Christian, it's really interesting, and you come from a different area domain of mine. Yours, I was interested to hear what you had to say about strategic management. My name is Dr. Kate Mclaughlin. I'm based in Manchester normally, but actually I'm calling from Marrakesh today, so a little bit exotic. But I didn't want to miss today's session, and I'm really glad I'm here. I've done research in social network analysis, and I've looked at it through the role of sustainability. And what's really interesting for me is sustainability changes that narrative from competitive to collaborative performance. And I was really interested to hear from your discipline of strategic management, and if so, how has that changed your thinking in any way about network research?
Thank you, Kate. You may have broken up a little bit. I guess that's the Marrakesh effect, right? No, but I appreciate your interest. So I should tell you, right, I'm a supply chain scholar. Our team, half of them are supply chain, half of them are strategic management, as I think are you. And so I'm not quite sure I caught the gist of your question, Kate. Are you asking from the perspective of a strategic management scholar?
I'm just I'm just
Mhm.
wondering how sustainability have you considered how sustainability in terms of how that would influence the four primary questions that you're asking? Because with the competitive narrative, and you said very clearly it's from that financial perspective,
Yeah.
but what we see with sustainability is
Mhm.
the use of the social mechanism and stronger relational tools as well, and seeking collaborative and not just
Yeah.
competitive advantage.
Right. So Kate, look, I agree. In fact, I remember we had early conversations with Dave, and one of the things he said was, consider, of course, focusing not only on financial performance, but also broadening the scope a little bit to look at, say, the environmental dimension, right, or a social dimension, which I admit at this point we have not incorporated in the paper. Now, I do agree competition can also convey benefits, performance benefits, let's say in terms of environmental performance, right? I think Dave may even have had a paper on that, if I'm not mistaken, right, a while back. So that is, I think, another extension of what we've been talking about. I will admit, Kate, we haven't given that much prominent thought so far, but I think you're right. What we should at a minimum do is plant the seed in the article to indicate that competition can also have or generate different kinds of outcomes beyond financial performance. So I appreciate the thought.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll go ahead and take one more question on this paper and then go on to the next one, but we can always follow up during the open forum portion of today's call to take additional questions on any of the papers. Well, I'll ask one question if there isn't any others at this time. Christian, can you talk a little bit about some specific characteristics within your model as it relates to the supply chain that would impact competitive behavior?
Yeah, Dave. So when you look at the past literature, right, again, we're making the distinction between partner firm level characteristics, relational, and then structural. And if you look at past literature, when it comes to partner firm characteristics, so these are usually resources or capabilities. I mentioned R&D, for example, right? Information technology. The one thing that's missing, which again, I think is probably more interesting here in terms of sparking ideas for future research, is the competitive activity of suppliers, right? So the nature or characteristics of a supplier's competitive action portfolio. How does that actually affect a focal firm's conduct? So the idea being, for example, if you have a very competitively active supplier, right, maybe with a broad repertoire, how does that affect the customer that actually observes and maybe is even subject to those competitive actions in terms of their own behavior, right? That's one thought here. When it comes to relational characteristics, again, we usually tend to focus on dependence, interdependence, for example, the degree of collaboration, relationship climate, and so forth. Again, I think what's here of most interest to us right now is probably this idea of collaborating in terms of how you compete, right? So the degree of coordination of competitive activity, I think, is something that you can actually measure. Right? You can look at the overlap of competitive action repertoires, for example. And then when it comes to structural characteristics, now, of course, I wish John Johnson was here. He's the network guru, right? But he talks a lot about structural equivalence, right? So the structural the structure of a supply network and specific gaps in those networks that give rise to competition. And there's, of course, a series of constructs that come out of network or social network theory that could be deployed here to examine how the structure of supply networks actually generates or creates competitive activity and associated performance outcomes.
Great, and Kate just contributed an idea in the chat box. She says, I think the density characteristics of the network influences isomorphism greatly.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, Kate. Thank you, Chris. All right. And when we come back to the general forum or discussion, let's also think about methods and approaches to investigate these research questions. So this initial discussion should be followed up maybe a little bit later as well. So we're going to go on to the next presenter. And that's going to be Abe Grover and Martin Dresner at the University of Maryland. So Abe and Martin, we'd like to learn more about your research now.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cantor. Greetings, everyone. So my name is Abe Grover, and I'm joined by Dr. Martin Dresner. We're both at the University of Maryland. This is how we are splitting the presentation today. So I'm going to do the presentation, and I'll let Dr. Dresner handle all the questions. In the spirit of time that we have today, the idea here is to give you a brief overview, an elevator pitch of what we're trying to do. As Dr. Hoffer talked about competition, so what we're trying to say is that the competition is not just limited to a market-based competition. The competition could be extended to non-market-based competition as well. And when I say non-market competition, I'm talking about, strictly for this paper, I'm talking about the political environment and how firms engage, proactively, reactively with their political environment to create a competitive edge for their supply chains. So I know it was a mouthful, but hopefully we can unpack this over the next 3 or 4 minutes. So firms, over the time, we have seen that the regulatory burden on firms has increased, and there are several papers that have looked into it. It's in the interest of the firms. The firms are trying to engage with their political environment, and when I say political environment, we're talking about the rules and regulations, the government, the outlook of the government, the orientation of the government, and how it facilitates the ease of business. So we're looking at political environment from multiple directions. So firms are engaging with the political environments for several reasons. So 2 of the reasons that you can see on the screen is one is for creating a competitive advantage and to avoid risk. So let's say trade wars, for instance. So the firms are trying to engage with the political environment to kind of decrease the risk from some of these political outcomes, such as Apple, try to engage with the U.S. government and try to lobby to kind of create more advantages for moving their chip production to the United States to get some tax advantages. So, for decreasing the risk, creating competitive advantage. And on the right-hand side, you can see a graphic which I got from represent.us. It's a nonprofit, which says, again, the figures could be overly exaggerated, but gives you an idea that for every $1 top corporations spend lobbying, and they get an average $760 in federal support and tax savings. So that says a lot about the advantages of the firms trying to engage with the political environment to kind of create that sustainable edge for their supply chains. So the idea here is for our paper is to look at what are those ways that the firms engage with their political environment, and what are the reasons that the firms engage with their political environments. So next slide, please. So the question that we're asking here is, in terms of political strategy, so there could be, as I said, there could be different ways that the firms engages with their political environment. So, how can firms facilitate their supply chain strategies through political actions? So it's a broad question, but so the literature, the supply chain existing literature that we looked at, kind of looks into how the political environment in terms of rules and regulations impacts firms and their supply chain performance. But there are limited studies out there that kind of look into or change the narrative, which we are trying to do is how the firms can engage with the political environment to kind of create that competitive edge for their supply chains. Now, there can be multiple ways in which the firms engage. And next slide, please. So this is our model that we're trying to look at. So this is we bring in the structured conduct performance paradigm here, for ease of because it gives you that political environment perspective. So the idea is that there are several strategic orientations motivated by different reasons that the firms try to engage with the political environment. One of them is the firms can and would try to influence their political environment, right? The other is that the firms could actually comply with their political environment. The third is that firms could even evade their political environments, which is becoming more and more evident with the counterfeit products in the supply chain, with supply chain frauds happening. So the firms could have motivations to evade their political environment, or the firms could even say that, hey, that we want to sit on the fence and do nothing and free ride on some of the political engagements of their competitors in the market. So what are these? How does firm chooses the strategic orientation in terms of engaging with the political environment is one of the questions that I think we try to address. So in terms of, this is how we kind of posit, we say that, if the firms try to influence their political, use an influencing political strategy, they would actually change the narrative of political environment, which would affect the market structure and how it's structured, and would eventually affect how the firm conducts itself in terms of supply chain strategies. These supply chain strategies could be, reshoring, nearshoring, vertical integration, supply chain traceability, even selecting the network and deciding on the, on several other things. So, the conduct eventually would impact the firm performance. So we're looking at how the firms could proactively or reactively influence their political environment. We're also looking at, can firms choose to proactively comply with the political environment for several reasons? If the firms anticipate a political policy, a political change in the environment, they could anticipatorily comply with that political environment for several reasons, such as creating a first mover's advantage in that game. So that could facilitate some of their supply chain strategies and improve their performance or the existing performance of their supply chain conduct as a whole. So, and as I said, evasion and neutral stance could also be a possible outcome. So we try to bring in the age-old structured conduct performance model and look at even the, also try to bring in the competitive dynamics here to try to understand, what some of these strategies, how they improve or, how the firms use them to improve or defend their competitive position in the market. But again, keeping true to the time, I just want to give you a high-level overview. So next slide, please. So the proposed questions that we have for our general consumption here is, again, very, very high level, is, when do political strategies improve supply chain performance? There could be instances, there could be, there could be specific political context. Let's say, the political strategies that work in the United States political context might not work in an Indian context, might not work in Chinese context. So when do these political strategies improve supply chain performance, under what context is something that we can look at. The other thing is that how can political strategies improve supply chain performance? And when I say how, there is a whole lot of mechanism that's underlying some of these situations. So how, can political strategies, integrate with your existing market-based strategies and improve your supply chain performance as a whole? Can they even substitute your market-based strategies, as you're trying to make those competitive moves? What is that underlying mechanism? And the last thing that we would like to, as we say, stir the pot here is that, what political strategies are best used to improve supply chain performance? As we said, there are different political strategic stances that the firms can take. They can either go ahead and influence their political environment, proactively get involved, get a seat at the table, or could even comply, be on the right side of the government. They can either evade their political environments or, stay neutral. So for future research, as we were talking about this, we're proposing a couple of propositions in this paper. So how they could be extended is, in terms of developing more case studies. I know the availability of empirical data within the political context sometimes become a little challenging, but then case studies and qualitative research can be really advantageous. And specifically looking at industrial context, what applies for the regulatory burden on pharmaceutical and food industry is really different from entertainment and textile and mining industry. So I mean, just trying to understand that industry context and within that industry context, how some of these different political strategies could advance supply chains in some of these contexts. So these are the things that we're looking at or trying to address in the paper overall. So, but I'm open to questions at this time.
Thank you, Abe. Sylvia, let's turn the floor over to the audience. Does anyone have any follow-up questions or suggestions for Abe and Martin as they continue to make progress with their paper? So I have a question. Abe or Martin, could you explain a little bit more about the unique role that the supply chain can play in terms of these non-market or market strategies that you're referring to in the paper?
Sure. Martin, I'll let you jump in as and when you want to. But so what we are looking at is from the supply chain context, we are focusing on supply chain risk management. And so we're looking at, the different strategies that the firms can use in terms of the supply chain risk management context. But then I think, staying true with the topic like network, how can supply chain network, how can you leverage supply chain network in terms of engaging with the political environment is something that I think needs to be answered in terms of the centrality or the structure of the supply chain network, how that helps you leverage that to advance your supply chain interests overall is one of the contexts. So there are different forms and different ways that supply chain gives you a unique advantage in terms of positioning yourself on leveraging your political environment in your interest. So that's the underlying goal on trying to understand some of those contexts that or those advantages that supply chain provides. So I hope I answered that question. Martin, I'll let you jump in if you want to expand on that.
No, I think you did a good job. We have a few hands that are raised. I think, Kate, you're first.
Many thanks, and thank you so much. Yeah, again, really interesting. And I suppose just from that network perspective, you were saying it'd be really interesting to look at this political strategy through the network perspective. And I think pre-competitive collaboration is a very interesting domain to see how political strategies are being leveraged. Within the domain of pre-competitive collaboration, we have antitrust laws, and we see within these platforms that industries are mobilizing these pre-competitive platforms to be able to leverage influence. Not only do they have the protection of the corporate veil, but more importantly, they now have the protection of the association. So as rather than one firm putting themselves out on a limb, they now have the protection of the association to be able to leverage that political power and influence. So yes, I think pre-competitive collaborations, and I was interested in what you said about resilience, because with resilience, we see dynamic environments about disruption. And we see that with disruption, when we have something like crises or panic buying, how the government can suspend trading laws and can look to creating competitive collaboration between industries to be able to address crises of supply in terms of disruption. So I think where you see the suspension of traditional trading laws in terms of crisis and disruption, where these pre-competitive clusters really come to the fore and take advantage is in terms of their clustering power in the network. And so it deserves definitely more scrutiny in that area and future research. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Kate. That was a very interesting insight. Dirk?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation as well. This is a good evening, by the way, almost from the Netherlands, but anyways. I was wondering whether this would be equally applicable, also the slide just in front of me, for small and large size companies. Actually, I mean, putting it a bit different, assuming that actually political influential strategies would only be applicable for really big companies, as you can usually also see. So are we not ignoring with this approach a little bit like 90% of companies that are smaller than the usual big pharma and the big food type of companies?
Sure.
If I could jump in, I would sort of like to bring in what Kate said, that there's certainly room for collaborative action for smaller companies. They can certainly lobby through industry trade associations in order to try to leverage a competitive advantage for their supply chains. I mean, when I look at the political environment here in the United States, some of the most powerful political actors are farmers. And although we have some large farmers here in the United States, many of them are fairly small farmers, but they've managed to leverage collectively their political action, their political clout in order to get many laws that regulations that favor their interests over other interests, for example, consumer interests.
Okay, thanks. Although then the relationship with firm performance might be a little bit more blurred, isn't it? I mean, also with farmers lobbying for certain issues could actually be opposite the interest of others. Like think about more organic farmers versus more industrial farmers. I guess their interests might be quite opposing and even detrimental to some effect. But thanks for the idea. Yes, thanks.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, in political lobbying, it's usually one set of corporate interests against another set of corporate interests. Or, when we see this all the time here in the United States, where the trial lawyers are quite a powerful lobby group, and they're often lobbying against some business interests because business interests don't want to have their product liability, for example, extended. So we see this quite often here in the U.S., I guess around the world as well. Arvind?
Hi, thank you. Very interesting paper, Abhay and Martin. How companies can facilitate their supply chain strategies through political action. I just wanted to bring this whole stream of research into the current geopolitical context, where there is a growing rivalry between the big powers, the United States and China, and much thought being given to in world capitals, in corporate boardrooms, and so forth, to this rivalry and the possibility of war over Taiwan, and even economic decoupling of companies out of China, which has been a major player over the last 4 decades in terms of global supply chains. So the question is, would it be to a firm's advantage or disadvantage to be the first to pull out of China as a signal, as a political action for companies? In strategic management, they call it the first mover effect. So in this case, would that be a pro or a con, an advantage, a competitive advantage or a disadvantage to signal a political action on the part of private companies? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Arvind, for that question. It's again, staying true to the time, I guess. It's a very, very, very broad question. But I think it depends on the company. It depends on the political situation of the company. And I want to go back to even Dirk's point as well. So what we try to do in this paper, and how we try to unfold this paper, is we look at firms, how the firms consider, how they perceive their political environment, in terms of whether they perceive the existing political environment and the existing situation to be favorable or not. And then also look at firms' resources. So we take these two antecedents as, the favorability of the political environment and the access to the resources that the firms have, in trying to understand what kind of political strategies they would use to engage with their political environment. So we do take into account some of the the resources at the disposal or at the disposal of the firms. But in terms of answering Arvind's question, I think it goes back to that dearest phrase, it depends. Definitely there is a first mover advantage in trying to reshore, nearshore, decouple from countries like China. But then I think depending on what that firm's future plans are, what the information is, they could set out to use that as a first mover's advantage. They could sit on the fence and just wait for some of the other firms to take that first mover's advantage and then just follow the suit. Depending on how coupled they are with China, and that's the other thing that we have to look at. How dependent they are on the Chinese government, and in terms of the consumer context and stuff like that. So I guess it depends, but definitely could work out for some of the firms that are trying to move over or decouple. So I'm not sure if I addressed your question. Like, Martin, do you want to jump in or say anything?
I think you did a good job. I have nothing to add.
But yes, if you, I saw a couple of comments on the chat as well. So if we can, I'll make a note of all the chats, and then we'll probably touch base beyond the webinar as well. But thank you so much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it. Really great feedback.
Good discussion so far. What I'd like to do now is turn over the discussion to Pankaj. So Pankaj, would you like to share your presentation and your screen?
Sure, thanks, Dave. Okay, well, thank you everyone, and thanks Dave and the team at GSCM for giving us very valuable comments in the first round. I think I'm preaching probably to the choir because everybody understands the the rigor at GSCM, but I've really appreciated the kind of thought, especially the A in our case had put in and giving us some very thoughtful comments. I really appreciate that. Talking about the research that we have done for the special issue, this is to build a computational model of supply chain. That's what we are proposing in this study, largely. And the joint work with my co-author, Professor Vishwanath Venkatesh at Virginia Tech, and I am here in India at Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. I'm Ahmedabad. And so the idea, the reason and the background for this research, let me make sure I can share the screen here. So the broad, I know this text is too much, so I'll give you just a big broad idea of where we were coming from. It was initially the idea of digitization of supply chain that has been around for a while. But what we wanted to do in this paper was build on the findings of this literature, but also extend it beyond the idea of digitization to this idea of computations. And computations is really the core in today's supply chain, because the kind of technologies that are now being used, they are everywhere. And computation is a concept that helps us conceptualize that ubiquity, as some have started to call it, of technologies. And to give you some examples in the supply chain context, I'm sure everyone here is has read these cases. AI is now used as analytics for detecting errors. If you are talking about product development, let's say, or in your operations, if you are approving credit card applications and things of that type. But beyond that, in warehouses, there are robots that are used to move materials around and doing the kind of things that humans would have to do, even not knowing that they are computing, such as moving on the road or moving inside or moving in an aisle, trying to find a particular SKU to pick and load. Similarly, AI in precision agriculture is one, or computer vision in precision agriculture, and robots that are able to give the right amount of fertilizer, pesticide, whatever it may, based on the condition of the crop. Route planning and optimization technologies, large retailers such as Amazon have shown how to implement them to create value for the supply chain. And there is a lot of work on blockchains these days that's coming up, and many other such technologies are increasingly coming in. There's talk about audio, AR, VR, virtual reality, and applications of that type that are transforming the way, let's say, the consumers tested which product would fit them. The fitting rooms that are getting smart mirrors that you can use to try the products and all. So supply chain is getting redundant, inundated with the computational capabilities of information technologies, and that's the basic idea, the backdrop and the context, and it influences and shapes and changes almost everything that happens in a supply chain, but most notably the value creation, which is the core for any organization. Supply chain gets influenced. So there are a lot of frameworks that have been used previously for studying supply chain, and our logic in this case was that we need to refine or present a new perspective of supply chain. So there have been some frameworks, not getting into the detail, but talking about SCORE framework, global supply chain, supply chain has been conceptualized as processes, the network aspect, the structure, the number of suppliers, and various other concepts and constructs that have been used to think about a supply chain. And so the idea in this research that we are proposing is that we should rethink from a computational perspective to assess and examine the effects of these advanced technologies in supply chain, especially in value creation. We need to think about a new model, which we call the computational model of supply chain. The model builds on this core idea of the value chain idea that value is created through the valuable outcomes are a result of certain organizational capabilities. And this comes as most of the people here might be familiar with from the dynamic capabilities perspective, that an organization is a bundle of capabilities. Now, capabilities are slightly different from processes in that they also include the firm's positions, the paths, and how it got to those levels. So they're a little bit more complex a construct in creating value. And if we go back to the hierarchical capabilities and the dynamics through which those engender, the idea is that there are certain value determinants, usually called as resources, that might lead to organizational capabilities after they are processed, if you may, or a computational dynamic is used. And so that is the broad model that has been studied previously in the literature and forms the core value pathway in our research. And the key difference we are making is we are saying that there are two specific types of resources that are the determinant of this value creation processes that trigger this hierarchy of capabilities. Those are the resources that supply chains process or apply their computational capabilities on to create organizational capabilities. And those two resources are matter and information. And so we are differentiating everything that happens in a supply chain from a perspective of a material versus information. Now, this can be considered arbitrary if you go into the philosophical ideas of what is matter and what is information. Right now, for what we are saying is for all tangible purposes, if you see a machine, that's matter. Just a very loose example, if you see a building, that's matter. And if you are seeing or not seeing, but if you know that there are digits or information, that would be the information resource. So broadly from that perspective, although one may argue that matter at some point was also information, where it all began, and you can go all the way back to the big bangs and everywhere if you want to go really physics into it. But not getting to that level of depth, what we are saying is in supply chain, it's good to think about matter and information are two resources or value determinants that trigger this value chain pathway. And the computational perspective then helps us apply or understand how these resources are created into capabilities. And in that, really what we are saying is that individual and organization are two aspects where computations are most studied before. So there is an organizational view, organization as an information processing mechanism attributed to Galbraith's, which means that you can study most organizations as just information processing systems to manage the uncertainty in the environment. And that's how they create value. So there is that, the core foundation of organization is computational processing or information processing. And on the individual side as well, it has been studied that there is a cognitive processes in the cognitive, and even in the case of procurement, for example, cognitive frames were studied by Shana Agrawal, and the individual reasoning has been studied quite a bit related to adoption of technologies, the type of strategies individual pursues and everything has been attributed to the type of cognitive frames and reasoning processes, etc. So both on the individual and organizational side, that perspective has been applied as computations. And so the idea that the computational perspective really can be used to analyze or frame the supply chains is what is the core. And just to give you the model, in the interest of time, this was the broad model. So if you see, we're saying that there is a behavioral dynamic, which is more individual relational dynamic that individuals have, which is computational in nature, which influences the core value pathway. So the core value pathway is embedded in this individual and organizational dynamic. The individual dynamic is largely individual, cognitive, or relational, as it may be the human processes. And then there's the organizational dynamic, which is largely around the structure and the governance within the organization. Now, there are various questions that can be studied within this domain, but our idea is that the core value creation is influenced by these computations. So if we are talking about GE, for example, using it's changing its total value model by saying that we are now going to use, detect the preventive needs of our customers. So GE has been in the business of selling machines. It sells to hospitals, to airlines, to large industrial hospitals, as I said, educational institutes, large industries. But what it has figured is that the value is really not in machines anymore, but in the data and analytics that they can go on machines. And if they were not capturing it, the IBMs of the world were. So what they did was they created this new model where they are now engaging not in selling of machines, but in outcome-based contracts where they say, we will guarantee you this much productivity, this much return from the machine, and we'll will take some profits or some parts of it based on the outcomes we promise, not based on the machine we sell, but based on the outcome. Now, these outcomes could be, it's easy to say how many hours of uptime and how less preventive and all, but it becomes really harder when you have to say productivity gains and others. And that's where a lot of these, implications of the model also come, is that are you able to create a supply chain which assesses value based on the computational value that you are creating, or the computational pathway, the value pathway, which is computational nature. Have you characterized value across that path? And there are a lot of those things that are now you can take examples of Nest. If you look at the Nest has thermostats which can give you how much energy you can save, what times are you using most energy, if you cut it down, how much value you can. So I can give you hundreds of examples of value creation through computations, which either process matter or information. So you are either taking the information about the machine, trying to find out whether it needs preventive maintenance, what times is it being used more, what times is the thermostat running at its full capacity, when is it that you can save on power, when you are out, when you are not, and so on and so forth. So either by processing matter or by processing information, applying the computational dynamics on either the matter-based data or the information-based, one can create advanced capabilities that lead to value. Value itself changes. Whether earlier days GE could have considered value to provide a particular preventive maintenance within 2 days, 3 days of the customer informing them, no more the case. Now the value has to be they informing about when the machine is likely to fail, when should they get the preventive maintenance and all that. So value could be seen as agility, value could be seen not as efficiency. And a lot of the different questions that arise, if you think of this computational model, which varies across, like I said, industry type, products or services, what is the value chain model, how it changes, whether the same value chain model is true for products or services. I've given you a few examples of questions, and those are the questions we have raised in the paper, and we are refining them further as we go forward. Is that we want to understand what is the what are the research questions that would be most relevant. We are trying to present that, and this is just one example. In the interest of time, not going through everything, but taking some example. For example, if you have to create more innovative products, how can you create that by processing information from different machines or facilities that you have? So that's a question. And that itself opens up a lot of things with IoT and other such technologies coming up. Those questions are already becoming pertinent, right? So IoT, yeah, it is feasible technologically. What do we do about it? So the answer could be, or the question rather could be, what are the innovative products that can be created which will be considered valuable if you were to use IoT as a technology to implement, for example? What is the role of automated alerts or product maintenance and repairs? What is the value? Can we assess it? How can we capture it? Does it vary across the type of industries? What value would be created in through these maintenance services? So there are a lot of research questions that come up as we talk about this computational view of supply chain. And I've given you, like I said, a few of these questions here. Can we think about service quality indicators and see how that service quality can be enhanced using processing of matter, just as an example, if you're using AI technologies and so on. So I'm going to stop at that, I think, in the interest of time, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Pankaj, for providing a summary of your research here. We are running low on time, and I certainly would like Mike and Henry to have an opportunity to share their research with the group in the remaining 5 minutes here. So if it's okay with the group, let's go ahead and just save the questions on Pankaj's presentation so that Henry and Mike can talk for a few minutes about their research, and then we'll come back for a wrap up.
All right, so with that, I'm going to go and share my screen. All right, so hi everyone. So our paper it takes a very micro foundational perspective by looking at the individual. So the foundation of this paper really stems from the fact that, well, all of us as individuals, we have both formal and informal roles at any given time. So, just because someone is a supply chain manager doesn't mean that person is not friends to somebody, or that person is not a coach for a soccer team. And this is especially prominent in vendor communities. So for instance, at Northwest Arkansas, Walmart has a lot of vendors as account support. And as a result, you have people working as buyers, as account managers, but then also at the same time, their kids go to school together. They might even serve on the same PTA board. And so then when we look at what happens when you have informal relationships that might spill over into formal relationships, and really vice versa, right? This is a kind of almost a recursive relationship here, where our formal interactions, so if we have a particularly contentious negotiation, then I'm not going to play your kid on the soccer team in the next game. Or if I want you to start my kid on the for the next soccer game, maybe I'm willing to give you some concession during next negotiation. And based on this different roles that we take, we use so we apply, we look at this relational multiplexity and develop a series of research propositions. And really, when we look at the supply chain management literature, this much is pretty well defined in that companies design supply chain roles, and supply chain managers carry out their roles, and that influences their resource access, influences the degree to which a company supply chain is competitive. And then also an emerging conversation looks at the social structure where that's influenced by environmental factors. I mean, especially these days with COVID-19, with the trade war, and a lot of other factors that previous presentations in this session have touched upon, and that influences how companies design supply chain roles. So, right now you see a lot of conversations out in industry where they wish they had a more robust team of supply chain managers who know what to do. To the point where Home Depot, Walmart, they went from simply outsourcing, to maritime or ocean carriers to chartering their own container ships, right? So we see this formal aspect very well defined in our current literature. Now, less defined is this whole aspect of informal role and how that influences how companies determine supply chain manager roles, as well as how supply chain managers behave and influence the supply chain, different supply chain processes. And on top of that, we also recognize that we have individual motivations. So beyond individual characteristics and how that influences our formal and informal relationships, and also we have, to varying degrees, our objectives in terms of motivation. And one key thing here is that this motivational foci is not just about individual, but also about what organizations want managers to do, to focus on as they carry out their job duties. So in the interest of time, we developed a series of 5 propositions in the paper, which we thank in advance to any potential reviewers who might be in the audience for your constructive feedback as we shape the paper to be more impactful. Now, beyond the research propositions, there were some other ideas that we summarized, we discussed in the towards the latter half of the paper, that is more exploratory in nature rather than prescriptive. So this whole idea of power or relational asymmetry, again, is well defined here in the supply chain management literature. And we bring in this whole idea of, well, the people who are spanning boundaries are individuals. And individuals espouse their own motivation, and their behaviors reflect the multiplexity of their relationship, not just to their firms, but also with each other. While resource flow may be asymmetric depending on firm level motivation, and then decisions made to determine resource flow may be influenced by individual motivation. The only conclusion that we can come up with based on our knowledge of extant literature is that when you have perfect symmetry between individuals and then perfect symmetry between companies, you have balanced resource flow. But what about the other quadrants? So what happens if person B really wants to improve a personal relationship, but firm A wants to improve interorganizational relationship? And so forth, be a permutation of different combinations. And then a second idea that we noticed here is in every boundary spanning role, you have your intra-team relationships with focal teams, and then you have inter-team relationships with cross-functional or even inter-organizational teams. And of course, the tasks and the goals and the resource objectives are different between focal and cross-functional teams. And at the same time, individuals have limited capacity, limited personal resources to devote to their simultaneous roles as part of their boundary spanning responsibility. So how does it influence resource contribution from focal team to cross-functional teams, as well as what kind of resources they can receive? But and this is just in one single perspective on the cross-functional team aspect. But what about beyond clearly defined boundaries? In the organization behavior literature, you have nested team structures where boundaries are not very clearly defined. And you have wholly owned subsidiaries, cooperative relationships, as some of the other papers mentioned here, temporary projects, so temporality, for startup organizations, as well as under turbulent environments. You have a lot of organizational changes, and as well as the whole concept of a holacracy that really received some prominence about 5 years ago, but since it kind of started to become less prominent in recent times, but it's many organizations such as Zappos continue to experiment with this idea of what happens when you allow workers to self-organize teams. So when you self-organize teams, your boundary spanning role is no longer described or prescribed to you, but instead, how does it change your motivational foci in terms of your resource devotion? And then the last aspect that we noticed that we discussing here is recognizing this temporal nature, that all of our present behavior reflect our past experiences as well as our future aspirations. Now, with a formal past experience, there will be things like job rotation, cross-training, as well as past employment. But then also there's also accompanying future strategies and a resource allocation that influence our present behavior. With informal aspect, of course, socialization, who we know at the present times help to determine our boundary spanning behavior and resource access. But then our personal history also influence our boundary spanning behavior. So things like education, if we went to the same school, then we're going to be more open to talking to other people from the same school, as well as movement, hobbies. So one of the big things, for instance, is serving on nonprofit organizational boards, and managers build relationships. So that's why we have to grade out dotted line, the influence socialization, as well as boundary spanning behavior. And then our future personal aspirations. So for a lot of, for some retailers, their buyers aspire to work for vendors. And so perhaps that influence their boundary spanning behavior to adopt more of a value seeding objective to try to improve their personal standing with a vendor that they want to move to. As well as personal aspirations that if a career is not right for me personally, then maybe my boundary spanning behavior is going to become less motivated and less aligned with my organization's overall behavior. So this is a very quick and high level view of what we're trying to do with the paper. And hopefully that gives us enough time to have a brief conversation with those who are able to stay.
Great. Thank you, Henry and Mike. So let's turn to the last segment of the webinar and just have a general discussion conversation about any of the papers that may have piqued your interest this morning. So I saw some notes in the chat box, some hands raised. Does anyone want to begin with their questions? Okay, I'll begin. Venki and Pankaj, I was going through some of my notes about your paper. Could you talk a little bit about the implications of your paper to the supply chain and IT workforce?
Right. So I think the one of the big idea is the training. Right. So when we say individual aspects, the bigger thing is the big talking point these days is how do AI and humans work together? I mean, augmented AI is one domain that is becoming very important, but in most spheres, human and AI, how do you train humans to work with AI and where is the balance, right? So that's on the big chunk of what we will face going forward. Now, this has been in the IT world even earlier. If you think of computer as a robot, I mean, the way robot is, it doesn't need to be a person-like structure. So any algorithm for that matter can be considered as a robot. And so if we think of it that way, there is some research that we already know, but the way the AI capabilities are now evolving, the type of training is very different because substitution happens on the skills that were initially never thought to be substitutable, such as reasoning, making choices, making decisions, even of the highest order. So I think the biggest implication from the workforce idea is what is the composition of workforce? What type of people will be most suitable in teams that have both robots and humans? How will the AI and human teams work? And we are addressing some of those questions in other research, but I think that will be my biggest implication on that.
Great, thank you. And then Henry, could you or Mike talk a little bit about the implications in terms of boundary spanning behavior from a competition perspective in supply chains? So how does your model help us understand how supply chains can compete more effectively through boundary spanning behavior?
Yeah, sure. So when we look at boundary spanning behavior, I mean, the ultimate purpose of spanning boundaries is to try to gain access to resources that our firm does not have, right? And sometimes simply approaching a supply chain partner in a strictly formal capacity might have limited ability for us to get what we want. But on the other hand, if we were to leverage our informal roles, assuming that such a role exists, then perhaps we can appeal to a better interpersonal relationship or leverage our better interpersonal relationship to gain access to resources that may otherwise not be available to our focal firm or focal team.
And then the final question for anyone who presented today, do you have any suggestions on how people can get started on pursuing answers to the research questions that you presented today? Any advice in terms of methods or approaches that you would recommend someone to follow to get started?
Dave, just to give the others a break, I'll I'll get us started here on the organizational level piece. It's always easy to talk about supply networks. It's really hard to measure them, right? And there are, of course, some databases that have been used. We all know FactSet, Revere, right? CompuSet, Customer Segment, Bloomberg, for example. I think one thing that's emerging, if you have the technical skill, of course, that is text analysis to identify supply networks. So firms put out communications, right? Think of annual reports or even press releases that basically indicate at least some of who their customers and suppliers are. And there actually has been research done, for example, out of the University of Southern California, that use very advanced and sophisticated text analysis methods to basically construct networks, supply networks around firms. and then generate accordingly measures of these supply network characteristics to then deploy them in empirical research. One of those researchers, his name is Gerard Hoberg. I would certainly recommend, if you're interested in these sorts of studies of supply network characteristics, look up their research. They even make some of their databases available online. I think that's a great starting point for people interested in that domain.
Great. Thank you, Christian. Abe, do you have any advice on how people can begin doing research on the topic that you presented today?
Sure. One of the things that, as I was looking at this topic is that, it's kind of hard to find empirical data on this, but then there is plenty of data that's available on lobbying, specifically just one of those political strategies, just trying to influence, focusing on just influencing part of it. So there is plenty data available on, what firms lobbied for on websites such as, secrets.org and stuff like that. So I think looking at some of those, even starting with case studies, I think case studies has a very important role to play when we are trying to understand the role of the firms and their political environment and how that overlaps with each other. That could be one way to kind of engage or start on this research. The other thing, I thought about it, but then, since we're in Maryland, we're close to DC, we could also start interviewing some of the lobbyists and see if, they had something to say just in terms of, the causes that they're lobbying for and issues on that matter. But again, I think the first way to go about it would be starting out with trying to understanding the role of political strategies and understanding the scope of how the political strategies are being used, especially for the supply chain, for improving supply chain performance. And there are plenty of examples out there that we try to address in our paper that could be expanded on. And it could be industry context, as we really mentioned. Looking at just food and pharmaceutical industry, which are heavily influenced by the political environments. And now the firms are realizing that it's not the time to sit out on the fence. They have to have some kind of participation in this domain. May be as simple as just having an office in Washington, D.C. or close to DC area or Maryland area, I guess. So I think that's how we can start.
Great. Pankaj, how would you recommend supply chain scholars start to gain access to IT databases or relevant data sources to launch an investigation onto the topic that you presented about?
No, that's excellent. I think both Abe and Christian have mentioned some great points. There is always secondary data. There is always case studies. That's always a good starting point. But let me add to that repertoire. Those two apply to us as well. Data is actually, I would say, less of a concern now. Christian is my, he used to be my sort of colleague not so long ago. I've just moved to India, and I'm setting up a center here, so I can offer whatever data you want, for whatever topic I can get you here, in the sense that we are talking with we're talking with the largest retailers, including Amazon and others, and we have access to the very top level, which means the head of the CEOs and others. And so, I don't think data, and any of people would be interested. I would personally, help if somebody wants to do research on that. But like I think Abhay and Christian have said, there is a lot of opportunities for doing cases, for sure. Trace data is very much in the IT domain, especially. You get a lot of data that is secondary data and trace data that is available, be it social media, be it network data, be it so many other sources that some of the people are using. And then companies, at least from the Indian perspective, I'm seeing a lot of companies are open to doing field experiments if you have something that can add value to them as well. And so I think that is also a very interesting proposition of field experiments, which I'm sure will enhance the domain very much. It will also be very interesting to tease out the questions that are there. So I think all of those are, and there is always the survey data that you can use to survey, and the kind of topics these are. In my conversation, company thinks that these are very relevant and new topics and not much known about them, and they're very open to understanding what can you tell us. I think there is that openness. If you want to even have a great survey of something, I think people would be very welcoming doing that.
Great, thank you. And then just to wrap up, Henry or Mike, did you want to offer any concluding thoughts in terms of how to get started in your area?
Well, I can jump in quickly since Henry's been doing a lot of the talking this morning. Obviously, as our work has took a much more micro foundational perspective, I think for me, then the opening point is, more at that individual level. And I think, we're familiar with the different tools in that space in terms of surveys and those kind of things that we can utilize to gain some insights into how individuals are perceiving their roles in the organization. And I think our perspective talks about maybe asking broader questions in terms of not just focusing on their formal roles or their formal expectations that they perceive, but also like what sorts of informal relationships do they have with folks. And I do think that those tools again exist maybe just in different pockets or different literatures of trying to understand how we can conceptualize those different relationships and different categories of relationships and different strengths of relationships that folks have. I think the other kind of aspect we think about from our perspective in the paper is the importance of the past or some path dependent sorts of things. And so I think that moves us maybe beyond thinking just like asking people how things are now, but moving to thinking or asking, gaining insights into how things were in the past. And so I think if we think about some of the secondary, the archival data that's out there, we think about some of the examples Henry went through about people that have had past working experiences or they've had the similar kind of educational background or somehow cross paths. I mean, a lot of that information is out there on things like LinkedIn or things where people are kind of providing this information out there for us to give us this ability to kind of construct some of this archival data to give us some insights into maybe these past relationships and how they may have an influence in the future or present and future interactions between individuals and thereby their ability to effectively carry out these boundary spanning activities for the firm. So an interesting question and just a few thoughts maybe to get some ideas working for folks on how they might get started.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for a very interesting and lively discussion on networks from a interdisciplinary perspective. Hopefully we gave people some good ideas to get started, to motivate more interesting research in each of these areas. So I'm very much looking forward to the completed papers in the next few months. And thank you everyone for sharing your feedback with the author teams.